When standardized tests were introduced in schools, the political left welcomed it. They saw it as a step forward for equality of opportunity. Even if you were from a very humble background, you had a chance to show what you could do. And even if you're from a very wealthy, prominent family, you sat the same test, and if you didn't actually do that well, then it was a level playing field. People could be selected on merit, equality of opportunity. The political left now, though, looks at these same tests and says, no, they're not good enough. Even though people are sitting the same tests, the same assessments, the results are not coming out the same. People from wealthier families are performing better than people from poorer families. This must be a grave injustice. They must be deprived of their opportunities in some way. There's some sinister discrimination or disadvantage taking place. And it's the government's job to put this right. And that's absolutely the philosophy of the Scottish Government.
Well, we're here marking the start of the new school term, but also to underline the Scottish Government's commitment to closing the attainment gap in our schools. I'm announcing today the latest allocation of funding from...
Who said that her administration should be judged on whether it manages to bridge the attainment gap in Scottish schools.
I'm launching the £45 million of allocations, announcing the £120 million to assist in closing the poverty-related attainment gap.
So you can see here substantial resources being invested on the basis of this philosophy, and it's a huge priority in Scottish education policy. In fact, Nicola Sturgeon's inviting us to judge her on their success at closing the attainment gap. Well, I'll tell them now they're not going to do it. They're going to fail for reasons I'll explain later. No emphasis on raising attainment for all, raising attainment for the brightest, for pupils in the middle of the road. If you've got a kid struggling but in a wealthy area, no interest in that at all. In fact, from their point of view, schools in wealthy areas, the worse they do, the better. If your goal is purely to close the attainment gap, you actually don't want pupils in wealthier areas to be doing well.
Focus on closing that attainment gap and the iniquity that it represents.
Okay, the iniquity that it represents, iniquity, grave injustice, evil. So it's not just the fact that some kids are brighter than others and that's the way it works out. There's some grave injustice at work here. So what could be the sinister cause of these unequal outcomes? First suspect is usually poverty.
For many schools across Scotland, there's a daily battle with economics. The life chances of Scots are set very early. By age 5, children born in the most deprived parts of the country will be over a year behind those with the most prosperous backgrounds when it comes to vocabulary, and about 10 months behind when it comes to solving problems. But even if they work hard to catch up, children from more prosperous backgrounds will progress at a faster rate, stretching ahead.
So there's no doubt from the BBC what the cause is. It's economics. But how does that translate into poor performance at school? Some people suggest that the parents are not intellectually stimulating the children adequately. Maybe they're too busy, they're not taking them to the museum, reading books with them, taking them to music lessons, etc. That's possibly part of the explanation. Maybe the parents are less educated, maybe their vocabulary is more restricted, their grammar isn't so accurate. So when they're teaching the children to talk, the children might find it more difficult to develop their language skills. There's possibly a little bit of something in that. Nutrition, might that affect the physical development of the brain in some way? Possibly. Children might have a less positive peer group, a less positive approach to education in some areas, very possibly. But the clear evidence is that all of these factors are minor compared to the huge factor that is genetics. Now there's 3 facts that are crucial here. If we accept these 3 facts, we have to accept the conclusion that follows from them. Fact number 1, people with a higher IQ tend to earn more money. That's partly because they become more qualified and partly because they're more effective in their careers. So there's a mountain of evidence. People with higher IQ have higher income. Therefore, in areas where there's higher income, there's likely to be, on average, higher IQ. Again, I think that's just a fact. It's indisputable. Obviously, there are some very intelligent people who don't make much money, and there are some quite unintelligent people who end up with lots and lots of money. But I'm talking generalities here. Right, fact number 2. IQ is heritable. There's a genetic component to it, and so very clever parents are more likely to have more intelligent children, not necessarily, but more likely. And middle-of-the-road parents are more likely to have middle-of-the-road children. Obviously, there are exceptions to that. It doesn't happen in all cases, but to a substantial degree, there is an influence from genetics on IQ. And the last thing is that attainment at school correlates very strongly with IQ. Pupils with a high IQ tend to do very well. Pupils with a low IQ tend to struggle and tend to gain less qualifications at the end of their education. Again, indisputable evidence. That should just be obviously true in any case. Those three facts combine to lead to the conclusion that in areas where income is less, there will tend to be lower levels of educational achievement. Not because of any injustice, not because of any sinister disadvantaging of children, but just from the facts of genetics and the correlations between IQ and other life outcomes. And that explains most of the attainment gap. Not absolutely all of it, but it explains most of it. So that's my explanation. Let's hear an expert talking about it now.
One of the areas of research I study is genetics and intelligence. So I mention this, I emphasize this because some people say, oh, intelligence, what is that? Well, it's one of the best measured things we have. It's one of the most important predictors we have. So it's an important trait. It's basically learnability. And say in terms of education, which I particularly study, some kids learn more easily than other kids. Any teacher will tell you that. But instead of assuming it's all environmental, we've got to ask, is it genetic? And behavioral genetics over a century has shown that individual differences in intelligence are heritable. If you take the world's literature of several hundred studies, twin, adoption, family studies, you come up with an estimate of about 50%. We find in the first year of school, literacy, numeracy, the things we teach in school are about 65% heritable. The differences among kids, even as they go into school, are very substantially due to genetic differences.
So Nicola Sturgeon talks about eliminating the attainment gap. She reminds me of King Canute commanding the tide not to come in. I think she's got the same chance of success. Now let's look at the other area that's sometimes blamed for the poor performance of some children in schools, their families.
You must throw something back on the parents. What's been happening to that child in the years up to 5?
What makes them so different? And the obvious answer seems to be, well, the family. But when people say the family, they think of what we call nurture. You know, the parents are providing opportunities for the children that maybe other children don't get. But what's exciting about our research is that it's showing that the biggest factor in why children differ in their ability to learn or perform at school is genetics, by which I mean inherited DNA differences between children that they've inherited from their parents.
There's a really important point here. If we're going to blame families for the below average academic performance of their kids, even as they start school, that's going to be taken as justification for ever more intrusive intervention in family life at ever earlier stages, with the alleged motive of saving these poor children from their parents who are going to inhibit their intellectual development. But we mustn't blame parents like that. We must resist the blank slate philosophy in order to protect families. Now, the blank slate philosophy is that all children are born equal with the same capabilities and potential, and it's just a matter of what happens to them. Their experiences, their nurturing, determine the outcomes. That just isn't true. It's a denial of science, and it would result in intrusion into family life and blaming parents unnecessarily.
The trouble is that the gap between rich and poor has remained the same, and despite a lot of poverty interventions, we've actually found it quite difficult to do that.
I really hope that we'll be able to be the first country in the world to reduce and in fact close the poverty-related attainment gap.
Speaking there, we had Professor Sue Ellis of the University of Strathclyde, and she is a Professor of Education, so she's obviously involved in training teachers. And the other gentleman was a representative from Education Scotland, the government's education agency, who effectively control schools in Scotland and set their policy. And both of them seem unaware of the science relating to the attainment gap. They're more driven by political philosophies, the belief that everyone is the same, born equal with the same capabilities and potential, so any inequality in outcome must be caused by some injustice and must be fought by the government. It's the social justice mindset. But these experts are apparently unaware of basic scientific facts at the heart of their field. Let's see what Professor Plomin's got to say about that.
Psychology about 20, 30 years ago, they didn't accept genetics at all. And now it's very dominant. Everyone accepts genetics. Education, however, is this backwater where they don't accept science by and large. People just use their hunches.
So extra help for weaker students, that's a good thing. Extra help in some poorer areas, that can be justified as well. Believing things that are not true, however, won't help. Believing that the attainment gap is caused by poverty won't result in better education policy. It might suit left-leaning parties' political agenda, but it doesn't fit with the facts. Now, some of the possible negative consequences of an over-concentration on closing the attainment gap are dealt with in my short video on equity and equality. Now, these issues to do with genetics and intelligence, there's good reasons to not really talk about them, not publicize it too much. We don't want to discourage kids in poor areas. Don't want them to assume that they're not going to do very well. We don't want low expectation to be the norm with kids and parents in schools in poorer areas. We want to encourage everyone to maximize their potential and to maximize the potential of the kids in their care. I mean, conversely, we wouldn't want wealthy people assuming that they're clever, even though if they do assume that, it shows that they're actually not that clever because we're only dealing with generalizations here. So why talk about it at all? The reason I'm having to talk about it is that a wrong explanation is being pushed and is set in educational policy in Scotland. And that wrong explanation needs to be countered with the truth. If the Scottish Government will stop presenting a false explanation, then I'll very happily stop presenting the truth, the uncomfortable truth, to counter it. Now, you may be thinking, all this social justice, equality-obsessed education policy, that's all very well for the left-wing parties, but I vote Conservative, so I oppose all that sort of thing. Well, let's see.
Well, we've had closing the attainment gap in Scotland as our top priority for a number of years now.
That's why there's a cosy consensus instead of rigorous debate in Scottish education. Government-controlled groupthink absolutely dominates all discussion in the Scottish educational system. That would encourage teachers and educationalists to try and look beyond the GTCS, Education Scotland, Holyrood mindset and hear dissenting views. It takes quite an effort to come across them because the normal run of things, they're just not there, they're not represented. I'd recommend Teacher Proof by Tom Bennett. That challenges some of the assumptions of modern education. That's very interesting. Also on the Scottish Family Party YouTube channel, you can find videos about GOFEC, Shinari, and a review of the GTCS magazine. So I'd encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, pressing the button just down here. And I'm going to finish with a fun clip from the film Harrison Bergeron. Harrison Bergeron is a dystopian short story of a future where everyone has to be completely equal. Enjoy.
Jeannie Bayliss, D+. I know you can do better, Jeannie.
Yes, Miss Hopkins.
Garth Bergeron, B-. I think you had a B+ on the last geography test, didn't you?
Yes, Miss Hopkins.
Well, this is quite an improvement.
Thank you.
Morris Wilkerson, C-. Good work, Morris. Geraldine Hoberman, C. Congratulations, Geraldine. Harrison Bergeron, A+.
Uh-oh.
Your grades are starting to creep up again, Harrison.
I know, I'm sorry. I can't help it. Do you want me to see Dr. Eisenstock again?
I think that would be best.
Harrison, what is the first article of the new American Constitution?
That all men are not created equal. It's the responsibility of the government to render them so.